Welcome back to The Word at Work. Thank you so much for being with us throughout our short series into Samuel. Today is our final episode, 2 Samuel chapter 10. Now, last week in chapter 9, we were introduced to the kindness of God's King, the kindness of King David. It reminded us that we really experience God's kindness every day in things both small and big. But today, in chapter 10, we see another side of the kindness of the King. So if last week, chapter 9, was an invitation to accept the kindness of the King, chapter 10 is a warning of what will happen if you don't. Well, let's pick up the story here in chapter 10. It's a long chapter, but the crisis that precipitates all the action happens very early on. The king of the Ammonites, Israel's enemy, dies, and he is succeeded by his son. When David hears the news, he decides that he will hold out an olive branch to the young new king who has just lost his father, and that he will show kindness to this young man. You'll see that there in verse 2. David thought, I will show kindness to him, just as his father showed kindness to me. It seems that David had had some previous experience with the previously departed king of the Ammonites. Now, we're not sure what that encounter was. It's not recorded for us in 1 or 2 Samuel. But we do know that in all the years that David was on the run from King Saul, he did at times shelter in the towns of his enemies, the Philistines being the noticeable example. It could well have been that the old king of the Ammonites extended him the same courtesy. But for whatever the reason, David feels like he wants to express kindness to the new king who has taken the place of the old. The problem is that when this new upstart of the Ammonites receives the news of David's kindness, he listens to bad advice. His advisors counsel him that this might be a trick or a trap or a setup, and so he chooses to reject the invitation of kindness from the king of Israel. And he makes his position perfectly clear. He takes the messengers who had brought the announcement of David's kindness to the Ammonite kingdom, and he humiliates them. He shaves off only half of their beards. He cuts a hole in the back of their pants so that their bottoms hang out. He does humiliating things to them and sends them off mocking and laughing as they leave. Now, these men are mortified, and as soon as that happens and David hears about it, it triggers 3 significant events. The first one is in verse 5. When David hears of what has happened, he restores the honour of his messengers. And it's only a short little part of this whole chapter, but it's one of my favourite bits. I love it. When he hears how his men have been humiliated, acting on his behalf and in his service, he sent messengers to meet them. And in their humiliation, the king said, stay at Jericho until your beards have grown, and then you come back. And it's just a beautiful moment where people who have served and suffered for their king are received back by their king with all consideration and gentleness. They experience the kindness of the king, and he looks after them, and he restores those who have suffered for his name. I love it. That's the first thing that happens. The second thing that happens was nothing. By which I mean, after David had made sure that his messengers were okay, he doesn't take any further action. David didn't retaliate against the Ammonites. I mean, he could have. He had every right to. But this teaches us something else about the kindness of the king, doesn't it? The kindness of the king is slow to anger. There is patience in David's kindness. He's not treating the Ammonites as their sins deserve. That means that the Ammonites still had a chance. I imagine that there still might have been a way back for them. But of course, that door is firmly shut in their face when we see the third thing that happens as a result of their rejection of David. The Ammonites hire an army and set out to attack Israel. That's verse 6. You see, rather than try to restore the relationship or see the patience of David's kindness, the Ammonites go on the offensive. The battle that they precipitate takes the rest of the chapter to tell. We're not going into it in any great detail now. For our purposes, what is important is that this is a battle that the Ammonites lose. If you reject the kindness of the king, it will not go well for you. That's 2 Samuel chapter 10. In chapter 9, we saw how wonderful it was to receive the kindness of God's king. In chapter 10, we get a terrible warning of what happens if you reject the kindness of God's king. So what is there for us in all this? Well, hopefully you've already started to make some connections for yourself. But just to put the matter beyond any shadow of doubt, won't you come with me now? Let's jump to the New Testament and turn to Romans chapter 2 and verse 4. Romans chapter 2 verse 4, Paul says, "Do you show contempt for the riches of God's kindness, his forbearance, his patience, not realizing that God's kindness is intended to lead you to repentance?" God's kindness is intended to lead you to repentance. That's true for you if you're not yet a Christian. It's also true for you when you become a Christian. Every time you sin, every time you fall short and encounter yet again the kindness of God, it's meant to stir your heart and lead you back to repentance. Now, if the Amorites had let it, the kindness of King David would have led them to repentance as well, and it would have restored a friendship with King David. But instead they showed contempt for his kindness. And the consequence, well, the consequence is not only played out in the narrative of chapter 10, but it's also described in the very next verse of Romans chapter 2. Have a look at the consequences if you reject the kindness of the king. Chapter 2, verse 5. "But because of your stubbornness and your unrepentant heart, you are storing up wrath against yourself for the day of God's wrath, when his righteous judgment will be revealed." As we said earlier, the new king of the Ammonites listened to bad advice. And by rejecting the kindness of God's king, he went with the crowd. It not only led him away from any of the benefits of the kindness he could have received, but it sets him up and leads him right into the judgment that comes from God when you mess with his king. He forwent any of the benefits of the kindness and only had to suffer under the judgment. Now, of course, for him, the judgment was swift and immediate, and it was executed within a battle which he lost. But of course, these things are written for us in the Old Testament, foreshadowing a far greater judgment, which Paul speaks of explicitly here in verse 5. The judgment of the day of God's wrath, when all of God's righteous judgments will be revealed. It's an incredibly dangerous thing to forego the kindness of the king and instead face his judgments. Learn from the mistakes of the new king of the Ammonites back in 2 Samuel chapter 10. Please don't walk in his shoes. Don't make the same mistakes that he made. Well, I hope you've enjoyed your time with us in this series, looking at Your Kingdom Come. We've not only seen the establishment of David's kingship over Israel in the Old Testament, but we've been able to see time and time again that he foreshadows and anticipates a moment when God's kingdom will come in its true fullness. And of course, that's not ushered in by David, that's ushered in by God's final and true King, King Jesus. It's why we keep dipping to the New Testament, because so much of the reality of David's story is echoed and fulfilled in the wonders of Jesus' story. Well, I hope in seeing more of the life of King David, you've been able to draw closer to King Jesus. Friends, thanks so much for joining us. If you missed any episodes in the series, they're still up on the YouTube channel. You must go back and check them out. And I hope you stick with us here at the Word of Work for the next series, which is coming up soon.